Marie, Carmen, hi. Hello, do you hear us? Hello, yes, we see you very well. Thanks for joining from Houston. Marie Carmen will be the last speaker of our conference, and we're very happy that you're zooming in from Houston and kind of also try and take a look back on the last 2 days, which you kind of participated in digitally. Marie Carmen Ramírez received a PhD in art history from the University of Chicago and is currently the Wortham Curator of Latin American Art and as well, of course, the founding director of the International Center for the Arts of the Americas at the Museum of Fine Arts in Houston. And it is a tremendously important research platform for anyone who is just slightly touching the field of Latin American art histories. Because this digital archive, I mean, including me, opened up a whole world which would have not been accessible and comprises, I think, over 14,000 documents of Latin American and Latino art of primary sources related to the artistic production of that region. Prior to her engagement in Houston, she was a curator of Latin American art at the Czech Blanton Museum of Art and an adjunct lecturer in Department of Art and Art History, both at the University of Texas in Austin. Ramírez curated numerous exhibitions, and we have an individual lecture just on those, but including, of course, one of Gego, including the traveling exhibition Gego Between Transparency and the Invisible. In her talk today, Gego, Finally in Germany, Marie Carmen will analyze the implications of the Stuttgart exhibition, Gego, the Architecture of an Artist, and the symposium on the current state of research on Gego, with particular attention to key open questions regarding her position vis-à-vis 20th century art. Enjoy.
It's been exactly 20 years since the Museum of Fine Arts Houston presented Questioning the Line, Gego's selection of 1955 to 1990, her first retrospective exhibition outside of Venezuela. Such a comprehensive show introduced Gego's singular production to US audiences by focusing on the development of line as both an intellectual and material presence in her oeuvre. Next. With over 150 works generously displayed in the Van der Rohe Pavilion, the show dazzled both art connoisseurs and the public. Curators, critics, and art historians, in particular, could not believe that an extraordinary artist, indeed, had developed outside the prevailing canon of 20th century modernism. Next. Over the last 2 decades, I have watched similar responses from publics in every city where Gego's work has been shown, from Mexico City to Buenos Aires, New York, Madrid, or London. Then, as now, an enormous impact was provoked. Gego's sui generis yet overlooked mode of constructivism seduced and intrigued viewers turned immediate fans of her work. This reaction is particularly revealing, since at the time, the artist was a largely marginal, under-recognized, and scarcely understood creator. The body of critical response her work had generated in Venezuela was largely unknown or unavailable outside this country. Audiences' enthusiasm for such work originated in the recognition that despite her marginal status, Gego produced an exceptional, if not idiosyncratic, body of work that demanded an equally unique reaction. What was singular about her case can be summarized by several features of her life story and art production. Certainly, her status as exiled Jewish woman working in Venezuela contributed to set her apart from the local scene. Moreover, the fact that she only decided to become an artist at the age of 42 made her from the outset a latecomer to post-war modernism. And yet, what continues to captivate viewers far and wide is the magic generated by the structurally innovative maze of hanging wires and prescient shadows. To this must be added her virtuoso handling of autonomous line, in works on paper and without paper, as well as the subtlety with which her drawings, prints, and wire constructions evoke elements of the natural world without representing them. Not surprisingly, the existing categories of modern art fall short of meeting the demands of such a hybrid, mobile, interdisciplinary proposal. While the last 2 decades are not enough to articulate a complete perspective on what I will refer to as the Gego phenomenon, they do allow insights into the big picture of the international reception and interpretation of her work up until now. The MFAH exhibition, in fact, coincided with the beginning of the discovery of her work by scholars and arts professionals worldwide. A number of solo exhibitions, both comprehensive and focused, were organized in the following years. Next. These include my own Between Transparency and the Invisible at the MFAH, Malba in Buenos Aires, the Drawing Center in New York in 2005-2006, Gego Defying Structures at MACBA in 2006, Gego Line as Object at the Hamburger Kunsthalle and the Kunstmuseum Stuttgart and Henry Moore Institute in Leeds in 2014, and more recently, Gego the Emancipated Line at MASPI in Sao Paulo in 2019. Gego's work was also showcased in large group exhibitions on Latin American or European modernism, such as Guy Brett's Force Fields, Faces of the Kinetic at the Hayward Gallery and MACBA in 2000, and Inverted Utopias, Avant-Garde Art in Latin America, which Hector Olea and I organized at Madrid's Museo Nacional Reina Sofía in 2000 and the Museum of Fine Arts Houston in 2004. Complementing these exhibitions, we have also seen the publication of a broad spate of catalogs and books focused on different facets of Gego's multidisciplinary production. Next. Taken as a whole, these multifaceted developments have filled gaps and significantly advanced our understanding of the artist and her production, while at the same time providing a much-needed starting point to sketch a critical balance of research surrounding Gego's work today. A balance that would allow us to adequately position the significant contributions of the 3-year research project undertaken in tandem by the Institute of Art History of the Stuttgart Universität and the Kunstmuseum Stuttgart. Next. Focused on Gego's education at the Stuttgart Institute, Focus on Gego's education at the Stuttgart Institute of Technology in the 1930s, these findings serve to ground the present exhibition and symposium as delayed, missing links to understand Gego and her contributions to modernism. For this reason, and taking into account the hindsight of 20 years since the Houston retrospective, I will venture that the results of this research initiative mark the beginning of a new phase in the interpretation and scholarship on the Gego phenomenon. Hence, in what follows, I would like to lay out the rationale for this assertion and the future very welcome implications. Next. To interpret is to translate an original. In Gego's case, can you go back to the previous one, please? Okay. To interpret is to translate an original. In Gego's case, the problem is that the researcher has to confront radical innovation stemming from a sui generis background and a one-of-a-kind artistic personality in order to fill in the blanks. While it is possible to identify dialogues with key 20th century artists and movements, we can think of Klee, Albert Soto, and Buckminster Fuller, to name some examples, Gego's approach to art stands on its own. Her independence, in turn, endows it with an air of elusiveness that contributes to its aura. Hence, the dilemma that confronts us as curators and art historians is a question: how to break through what is ungraspable without falling into facile platitudes and stereotypes. Next. Trying to apprehend such an approach to art, the 2002 symposium that took place in conjunction with Gego, Questioning the Line, sought to open lines of inquiry into her position vis-a-vis post-war modernism and postmodernism, in the form of challenging questions. It is pertinently to briefly revisit here some of those questions in light of what has transpired in the last 2 decades, as well as the exhibition and symposium we are celebrating today. What exactly is Gego's specific contribution to 20th century art? How is her art different from tendencies that preceded or coincided with her in time? Was she responding to a particular local tradition, such as that of Venezuela? Or conversely, does her proposal belong in the universal narrative of post-World War II art itself? The ultimate aim of these questions was to avoid pigeonholing Gego in the conventional straitjacket narrative of modernism, while encouraging new frameworks of interpretation for her pivotal straddling between Europe and Latin America, as well as the legacy of constructivism, concrete art, and geometric abstraction. This task involved recasting these canonical accounts to embrace the far-reaching consequences of her autonomous and visionary project. As with many 20th century artists who lived and worked in Latin America, questions as such also pointed to a long overdue discussion that had only recently begun to take shape on both sides of the Atlantic. Next. Until then, the endeavor of situating this German-born Venezuelan artist into the broader context of 20th century modernism and postmodernism had been hindered by several factors, not the least of which was Gego's own silence with regard to her own work. As we know, despite her conceptual and artistic sophistication, Gego was not an artist who engaged in major theoretical arguments. Even in the short texts that make up Sabiduras, the collection of writings we published with Fundación Gego in 2005, she deliberately shied away from the extensive written or oral explanations about her production. Whether or not this reticence can be traced to her inherent shyness, her imperfect handling of Spanish language, or even a natural dislike for rhetoric, the result is a self-contained body of work that escapes commonplaces of understanding and interpretation. Overcoming these intrinsic limitations, the exhibitions and publications I referenced earlier, as well as the scholarship that has supported them, have made significant inroads in answering some of the initial questions surrounding her work. Working in tandem with Fundación Gego, scholars have clarified titles, dates, and technical issues pertaining to specific series or works. In Venezuela, her position with regards to the country's cultural milieu has been the object of extensive research, particularly in reference to her contact with the triumvirate of the so-called cinéticos, Jesús Soto, Carlos Cruz Diez, and Alejandro Otero, and their status as state-supported official art. Her relationship to Venezuela's incomplete modernization project has also received a great deal of attention, leading some critics to characterize her position as an involuntary modernism, or following an ultra-nationalist impulse to interpret her webs in terms of a vernacular aesthetics stemming from ranchos, or the Venezuelan shantytown constructions. North American and European scholars, in turn, have engaged the artist's nexus to post-war constructive and geometric trends originating in both Russian constructivism and the Bauhaus, sometimes establishing her independence from these sources. In these contexts, the affinities between Gego's idiosyncratic production and that of other post-war women artists, as well as her use of craft methods and materials, have been probed in relative depth. This is also the case of the methods and strategies she deployed in her drawings and drawings without paper, the subject of my own research on the artist. Furthermore, Gego's site-specific magnum opus, Gran Reticularia of 1969, has not only been elevated to the status of key monument of post-war constructivism, but is now the subject of a volume of its own, bringing together over 150 texts that shed light on its paradigmatic ingenuity. Despite these scholarly advances, however, there remain until now a huge gap in our understanding of the origins of Gego's independent approach to constructivism. I refer to her roots in her native Germany and the vacuum regarding her professional training in Stuttgart in the 1930s, which prompt the questions, What exactly did Gego learn in Stuttgart? How did the educational tenets of the Stuttgart Institute of Technology contribute to her artistic development? How was it different from the teachings of the last Bauhaus? Interest in this until now not accessible period of her life responds to the need to probe the background of her singularity, as well as to the desire to generate links and dialogues with her work as a whole. While essential, however, the discussion of origins frequently turns quite challenging. It is to Stephanie Reisinger and her team's credit that they solved this impasse with objective evidence culled from private and public archives in Stuttgart. Focusing on the architecture and urban planning perspectives taught at the Institute, they were able to reconstruct Gego's entire curriculum, as well as the content of her classes. More importantly for our purposes, they were able to research in depth and for the first time, the nexus between the architectural training and artistic concepts in her work. As a result, to paraphrase Paul Klee's well-known statement, if the exhibitions organized up until now reproduced the materiality of Gego's production made in Venezuela, the present exhibition and symposium turned visible the theoretical and practical background. In my view, this is no small achievement. It is indeed the missing link without which future studies on her oeuvre would always be limping or incomplete. Of the many big and small findings brought to light by the German team's research, I would like to briefly comment on three of them that not only shed new light on aspects of her trajectory, but in doing so, have the potential to shift the lenses with which we have viewed Gego until now. Next. The first finding concerns the impact of her combined architectural and engineering training. Can you go back to that? The first finding concerns the impact of her combined architectural and engineering training and how this shaped the artistic approach developed many years later in Caracas. It is a well-known fact that Gego was trained and obtained degrees in a pair of professional fields. This dual training set her apart from other artists working in constructivism and geometric abstraction. Exception perhaps were Naum Gabo and Lisitsky, trained in engineering and architecture respectively. However, not until now did we learn the specifics of this type of specialized education and its implications for her artistic practice. At its core lies the notion of the architect-engineer, a hybrid feature of the European educational and professional system that considers both the architect's involvement with forms into space and the technical means to make it function on an equal, complementary level. As an architect-engineer, Gego was trained in craft skills, building technology, expanded knowledge of materials, and site-specific thinking, all of them inherent to this double role. She was also exposed to both technical and freehand artistic drawing. Such complementary role explains, on one hand, why in her series, space dominates above other elements and no form can escape being actively involved in its surroundings. On the other hand, it also illuminates Gego's conceptual and manual resourcefulness, grounded in undeniable technical construction principles with which problems related to the unfolding and articulation of lines in space were solved. Her mastery of technical resources translates into a bold emphasis on the active, physical engagement with the materiality of the work. As Richard Schiff has observed, Gego's, and I quote, structured yet still evolving materials convey the sense of her hand, even though she herself is no longer present, end of quote. Next. The point that I wish to underscore here is the simultaneity with which the architectural and engineering functions interface. That is to say, the artistic vision coexists in all her series in tandem with that of the architect organizer of space and the engineer duly crafting the technological means to make possible every single development. In this sense, the seamlessness with which Gego deploys in her practice these dual roles confirms Marta Trava's sharp observation that Gego, and I quote, thought like an architect, resolved problems like an engineer, and rendered like an artist. End of quote. That is, the artist undid scientific order, seeking to achieve spatial dynamics as well as occupancy of the void. Only by supporting herself on these three operative lines, that rather than convergent are dialectical, can the permanent tension as well as the complexity of her work be explained. Such a tension coexists in the implicit nexus between the mathematical objectivity that animates Gego's geometrically based webs, nets, and wire constructions, and last but not least, the playful, subjective imagination that constantly undermines her supposedly strict rationality. Next. Far from subjecting herself to the merely operative aspect of any technique, her great contribution lies in an ongoing tension, grounded in her irrepressible impulse of going beyond established premises. Hence, while her proposals have an unquestionable technical point of departure, they invariably supersede the impersonality of a reflexive act. Wires, stainless steel, structural nuclei, all are charged with a manual touch through which the coldness of the materials disappears. Next, the complementary tension between the architectural and engineering facets of her practice is also present in the nodes articulating the triangular system of reticularias, or the linear sequences of the chorros. Next, nodes function as joining points to link what is essentially a structural engineering problem. Nevertheless, their profuse presence, spread throughout the works, introduces an element that is free, loose, unexpected, that is architectural. Here, it is important to note not only the physical function of these articulations, but moreover, the artistic persona of the maker. Next. The technical solution of the nodes, allowing the vast profusion of lines and wires in different series, implies the key element for the flexible, irregular growing of her pieces, so that the regular technical trait, a constant, dialogues with the architectural shape to be implemented, the variants. They can be seen as residues of a technical tool, but they are really the objective part, a key to support the implementation of the work itself, without which the subjectivity conveyed by the artwork does not pan out. Stemming from such considerations, the structural freedom with which Gego operated allows us to say today to see her as a notable exception to the hegemonic rule of the European avant-garde canon and its worn-out conventions. What her ability articulates is the tenacious placing into question of that paradigmatic rational order. Her hybrid artistic proposal must be considered, in my view, more from a loose, disconnected axis instead of a syntagmatic one of official avant-garde history. Next. The second insight concerns the impact of our architectural training in the development of the parallel line method structuring her works on paper and many of her stainless steel constructions. The Stuttgart research confirms what many of us suspected all along, that the origins of the parallel line system lies in the architectural drawing methods she learned in Stuttgart. Being an essential component of her curriculum, Gego learned how to differentiate, sketch, and cast lines in order to define, circumscribe, or open up space. She also mastered the use of parallels to define the degree of materiality, either transparency or opacity of a surface, as well as the light and shadow conditions at play. While this finding may appear self-evident, I believe it is a seminal point that needs to be underscored. It grounds her future explorations of the autonomy of line in a functional tradition of drawing devoid of representation that goes beyond the strict realm of the fine arts. Furthermore, it is precisely this trait that lies at the core of Gego's apparent eccentricity regarding other avant-garde exponents of constructivism. An exception, again, is Nam Gabo, whose training as an engineer also supported his investigations of line in space. Gego appeared when she observed in a well-known quote, and I quote, "I never consciously decided to be my interest and work in the visual arts developed in me gradually, a number of factors, but mainly through my training as an architect," end of quote. What I find intriguing, however, is that at the time when Gego decided to fully pursue her artistic interests, she did not immediately resort to the structural linear method. Next. Instead, she experimented with a number of approaches based on figurative and natural reference, as well as techniques, from gouache, which is exemplified in the slide you're looking at right now, to cassine. Next slide. It is as if she felt compelled initially to find her way with resources associated with the fine arts and not with her technical training. Next. The parallel line method only emerged in the late 1950s, first associated with line-based compositions that evoke a transparent curtain effect. Next. Followed by architectural or constructive shapes. Next. Or drawings inspired by the art, the drawings of Paul Klee. Next. The hatch lines were further developed through her active dialogues with the work of Joseph Albers. Next. And also with Jesus Soto. Next. By the mid-1960s, however, the discovery of the autonomy of line led Gego to advance a structural method applicable to both her two-dimensional works on paper and her three-dimensional constructions. The small booklet, which she titled Relations in Transparency of 1964, can be seen as a compendium of the different strategies that made up her relational line system. Next. By means of this methodological approach, her work unfolded from one, and I quote, "from any one line according to a structural system that allowed her to embark on an active exploration of the myriad possibilities of autonomous line." Next. Of particular interest is Reisinger's description of the architectural hatch line method that she learned in Stuttgart and its role in modulating the material and degree of transparency or opacity of a surface, as well as the light and shadow conditions that affect it. Indeed, the nexus between the hatch parallel line method also plays a key role in Gego's pursuit of transparency through light and shadow. As I have argued elsewhere, the notion of relations in transparency is critical to understanding what makes her drawings and constructions so different. Intrinsic to her belief in the pre-existence of an interconnected whole, the parallel lines in Gego's work do not designate, but rather make present the in-depth interplay between intangible components of her diaphanous universe that lead into the invisible, such as air, space, nothingness, light, and endless triangulation. And I think I was missing a slide there. Can you advance the slide, please? Intrinsic to her belief in the preexistence of an interconnected whole, the parallel lines in Gego's work do not designate, but rather make present the in-depth interplay between intangible components of her diaphanous universe that lead into the invisible, such as air, space, nothingness, light, and endless triangulation. I must also underscore the dialectical reading that her proposals demand. Without strokes mediated by drawing or wire, these elements could never achieve their paradoxical beauty, that is, their insubstantial materiality. In other words, Gego does not draw lines, but rather uses them to make of that back and forth between the subjective insubstantial and the objective materiality a theoretical argument on the slide. Next. A third insight contributed by Reisinger's research concerns the notion of an organic social space, which Gego also encountered in her professional training, particularly through the urban and architectural philosophy of Heinz Wetzel. The latter's emphasis on a true-to-life approach to architecture, stimulated by immersive walks in the city, aimed at grasping live spatial relationships, find echoes in Gego's own approach to space in her work. Wetzel wrote of geometry spoiled by raw reality, or, and I quote, geometric form forced out of the sphere of abstraction and into the living reality by its relation to its surroundings, end of quote. Next. Reisinger and others have drawn pertinent connections between his teachings and Gego's site-specific public projects in Caracas. However, I would like to suggest that this integral understanding of the rhythm of reality in urban space is also at the core of Gego's drawings and constructions and establishes an important source of her art making. Next. I refer to a persistent ambiguity between the self-referential notion of structure and the constant allusions to the organic world of nature implicit in the titles of many of her series, such as Chorros, Troncos, or Bichos, as well as in the activated space of many of her works. Through this ambiguity, Gego unwittingly achieved something close to what George van Tongerlo and other artists vividly pursued. Her work sensitizes us to nature without reference to its immediacy and with defining it directly. Next. Gego also achieves this through a particular notion of space that, while grounded in constructivism, supersedes it. As Hani Osod observed, with regard to her Gran Reticularia, the Museo de Bellas Artes in Caracas, and I think that Pablo was also alluding in his presentation, and I quote, "The support line in Gego's work never forgets the memory of an enveloping human awareness," end of quote. Indeed, the viewer not only participates in the environmental installation, he or she is the agent through which the piece comes together in a continually evolving and unpredictable spatial situation. Next. Yet this sense of space that harbors the suggestion of a human or organic presence also applies to her early parallactical sculptures, which require the displacement of the viewer in order to produce their subtle kinetic effects. Next. It is also present in her drawings, next, prints, and particularly in her drawings without paper, next. Finally, all knowledge is the result of incremental, accumulative developments over time. The transatlantic pertinence of this symposium has brought to light an urgent task, that of establishing the type of conceptual and practical bridges that the artist's immigrant status demands in the context of exile. The promise of encounters such as the one we're concluding today will undoubtedly rest in structuring the nature of the Gego phenomenon while sustaining themselves for the first time with one foot on both sides of the Atlantic. In such a straddling context, one final comment is timely. Reisinger underscores the primary role which architecture exerted in Gego's oeuvre, while in the process elevating it to the primary language that articulated her art. I will take this conclusion a step further. That is, situating herself in the realm of the architect-engineer provided her with in-between-the-lines insight, with an outsider's perspective. Such a perception allowed her to collapse traditional fine arts distinctions between mediums and modes of representation, to produce linear constructions that are neither sculpture nor drawing nor architecture. It is also what makes her lines be more than a line, and her images stand in between abstraction and nature. Gego is Gego, and this productive excursus to Stuttgart has finally provided us with the key to understand the profound roots of her tenacious singularity. Thank you very much. Gracias.